The geology tour that we've been talking about and promising to do, it has been scheduled, and we're working on getting everything straight away. That's going to be May 9th. And we're working up the flyers and everything for it now. It's going to be a fun activity. It's $40 per person, or I don't know the prices, but we'll be sending everybody a announcement on it. Something like $75 for two, and then there's a family rate or something. But the idea behind this is we'll have an opportunity to actually go around Pittsburgh in 8 or 9 different sites. And with Steve Austin, who is actually creation's leading geologist, and he's going to take us around Pittsburgh and show us the sites, so to speak, geologically speaking. And I've done the tour once with him, and it is really amazing, the geology that we live around here in Pittsburgh. So if you can do that, that would be a great thing. What we'll do is we'll meet at a particular location and then hop in buses, and it's usually like from 9 to 4. So it's an all-day event. We have lunch somewhere, I'm not sure where, but all these things will be arranged here, and everybody will get an announcement probably within the next week or two at the latest. So you want to keep that on your schedule. So that's May 9th. And then also, June, which date is it, Steve? First week in June? Okay, yeah, I'm not sure what the date is. Okay. Jason Lyle of the Institute for Creation Research is going to be here in Pittsburgh giving us a lecture on dinosaurs. And this is an incredible lecture. And so we'll send that information out to you as well. But May 9th is the geology tour of Pittsburgh, and the first week in June is the dinosaur lecture from Jason Lyle. He's an astrophysicist with the Institute for Creation Research and a very good speaker. All righty. I think that's it, is it not? So why don't we get to our evening session here? And I'm glad everybody is here tonight that is here. This is our last session for this series, and I hope people have. I hope everyone has gleaned something from it. I hope we have a little bit better understanding of what the creation model is, and maybe a little bit about how we should be discussing the creation model to gainsayers. And that's a segue into our session tonight. We're going to be looking at creation apologetics and taking the creation model and applying it to 2 particular areas that we can discuss and use the creation model to be a positive influence on various things. So let's get to it. So what we'll do is we'll look at the issue of apologetics, define what it is, and how we use that to argue for creation. And then we'll take 2 particular applications of the creation flood model of origins and discuss how they work out. And the first one that we'll be looking at is the biblical model of aging. You and I are all getting older, and we're going to someday die. And that's a very important thing, actually, when it comes to the creation flood model, because the creation flood model actually explains why we age. And then we're going to be looking at this issue of environmental management. What does the creation model have to say about environmental management? And we'll have a little bit of a video there that you may react to in different ways, and I'll be anxious to hear how you react to it. So let's take a look at apologetics, what it is, and how we are to use these things for creation. Well, the word apologetics is a compound Greek word, and it's from the Greek word apo, which means from. It's the word that we get apogee. It's the furthest point in an orbit of a planet away from the body that it's rotating around. And then the Greek word logos, which is actually the formal name of Christ, as we saw, I think, in the second session. But the word has an extremely rich personal notion to it. So, since it's the word that we get logic from, we're talking about a particular logic, not Boolean logic or other types of logic, but we're looking at a personal logic. So it's a very personal thing. So our compound word literally means from the word or from the logic. Now, I've never heard any lecture on apologetics that actually states that. They always talk about apologetics as being defending the faith, which is true. But it's very important that we look at the etymology of the word and how the word is constructed, because it's telling us how we are to defend the faith from the word. Okay, it's very interesting that that is our starting place. So we actually defend our position from the biblical text. So, having that in mind, how often have you heard this statement? I'm a young earth creationist because the evidence best fits the model. Okay? Now, I happen to agree with that particular statement, but first of all, is the statement true? And is this a good way to defend the creation model? All right. Well, is the statement true? The answer is yes, but for reasons that may not be obvious at first. In fact, the phrase "evidence best fits the creation model" really is the part of the sentence that we want to focus on. The answer to that, of course, is yes, but why? And then, of course, is this a good way of defending the young earth creation model? And the answer to that is absolutely not. So, why is this a bad defense? Why is it bad to present the creation model, or you believing in the young earth creation model, in this way? Well, and I've experienced this many times. If one's opponent has done more homework than one may lose the battle. I think a little bit of grammar needs cleaned up there. So in other words, if your opponent has done a little bit more research, a little bit more homework than you have done, you may lose the argument simply because you haven't done enough homework, because you don't have a sufficient number of evidences in your bag of tricks, if you will, and you lose that battle for the day. Well, unfortunately, this sort of thing, as if you and I can sit down at a chalkboard, present evidences for the young earth creation model versus, let's say, evolution or old earth creation model. And this, unfortunately, is based on this idea that if I take the evidence and add to it my human reasoning, then I should come up with a victory, right? Well, that's a false axiom. And why is that? Well, it's because it presupposes that the so-called evidence is model neutral, and that's an important thing. There are no brute facts. Everything that you and I think, do, and say, everything that we articulate, every thought, comes along with a set of presuppositions. Okay, so there's no such thing as a brute fact that is a fact in and of itself. Okay. Now you may say, well, wait a minute. What about the laws of logic? Don't they work whether there's mass or matter or someone to think about them? Don't they exist regardless? The answer to that is yes, but the ultimate question then is, why is that? And you ultimately work your way back to the set of presuppositions, and from a biblical point of view, it is the infinite personal creator God. So let's take a look then at how the Bible defines apologetics and how you and I are to defend the faith, so to speak. All right, one of my favorite verses from the book of Proverbs. It may sound contradictory to you, and I hope it does, because you'll get the point. Proverbs 26, verse 4, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be also like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit." Well, of course, this is a wonderful statement, simply because it is Scripture. But it also seems to be contradictory, doesn't it? Don't answer a fool according to his folly, and in the very next breath, answer a fool according to his folly. What's Solomon trying to tell us here? Well, I would argue that it's not contradictory at all. All right, let's take a look at verse 4, the first sentence in our, the first verse in our set here. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like unto him. What's he saying? He's saying, do not argue your position within the same worldview or presuppositions as your opponent. Okay? And this happens all the time within the ranks of creationism. Now you might say, Bob, can you give me an example of such a thing? Yes. How often have you heard a creationist defend the creation model by using the same pagan ideas that an evolutionist would use? The notions of chance, that is, the way in which an evolutionist would understand chance. Oh, the probability of evolution occurring is so low, it can't possibly be true, therefore creation must be true, right? Well, that's not a convincing argument, and do you know why? Because there's always that little bit of probability that says it can happen. So when you argue probabilistically, you have to lay down the rules of the game before you can use probability. See, from a creationist perspective, there's nothing really random. There's nothing really random in the universe. We just use the quantum fluctuations. That's just a mechanism by which you and I can understand the universe in a way. It's not that there's an inherent uncertainty in the universe. Okay? We talked about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in maybe the third or fourth session. Okay? There's not an inherent uncertainty in the universe. So that so these things then we don't want to argue within the same worldview, same set of presuppositions as our opponent. And do not argue your position within the evolutionary worldview of chance, probability, and materialism. See, the evolutionary camp, they want to argue that material in itself has the ability to coagulate from molecules to man, right? Isn't that really the fundamental axiom of evolution? Well, why use that same kind of materialistic notion for arguing creation? So we do not want to argue the creation model within the same set of presuppositions as evolution. It's kind of like arguing apples from within the orange tree, so to speak. Do not argue your position within the paradigm of long ages. Okay, so often arguments that are used for generating an old Earth view of the universe, this is within the creation house, so to speak, are used for the young universe model, and we don't want to do that either. So the point being here is that argue your own position within your own worldview. Don't use his to argue your point. Now, what about answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit? Now, what does this phrase mean? What is Solomon trying to tell us? Using your opponent's worldview and presuppositions, reduce his position to absurdity. In other words, take his presuppositions, his worldview, and use it against them. Okay? So in these two verses, Solomon is telling us to take basically two approaches with the same opponent. So show that your opponent's worldview collapses on its own weight. You know, the evolutionary materialistic worldview, there's so many things it can't explain. And I don't mean that it's having difficulty, but it's fundamentally contradictory. And let's use this to show that this model doesn't work. Show that your opponent's set of presuppositions are ultimately self-contradictory. Okay. So this is the way in which we should be answering and arguing. Now the problem with this is it doesn't lend itself to an instant iced tea kind of world, right? To a soundbite kind of approach. So often I refuse to get into arguments because what people want to do is they just want a collection of sound bites. And I'll ask them up front, are you willing to sit down and discuss this rationally for, let's say, 30 minutes? And if they're not, then I don't even bother with them. And that's not wrong. You know, I don't think we should allow ourselves to get into these soundbite kind of arguments. Not that we shouldn't have sound bites prepared, but if we really want to reduce our opponent's position to a set of self-contradictory notions, then they should be willing to sit down with us. And if they're not, well, ask them to come back another day. So, the biblical method of apologetics particularly attacks the very foundation of its opponents. And until relatively recently, creationists have focused on the fruit of the evolutionary paradigm rather than aiming at the roots and trunk. So in other words, a lot of creation groups would simply say, see, evolution leads to this, it leads to that, and so on, which may be true, but it's not really getting at the root of the problem. And I'd say probably within the last maybe 15 to 20 years, creationists are starting to see that attacking various issues, is not the way to refute the evolutionary mindset or the materialistic mindset, which is really the religion that we are fighting. The biblical worldview gives the only rational basis in accounting for the scientific method. The reason why the scientific method works is because God is a knowable God. He is an orderly God. He is both unity and diversity. He is both a many and a one. And that is why the scientific method works, because God is orderly, and therefore you can rationally examine His universe, which reflects His nature of orderliness and knowability, and come up with having somewhat of an understanding of how His universe operates. So those some who profess to align themselves with the biblical apologetic incorrectly dismiss the scientific method. Now you might say, what do you mean by that, Bob? Well, there are people who believe so strongly and so misguidedly in the idea of presuppositions that they completely ignore the scientific method. But in fact, one's presuppositions, the biblical apologetic, provides a meaning and foundation for the scientific method to work. And but these people feel that, well, you don't need to do science. You don't need to go out and develop the model. And that's a major problem. As of 2015, how many creation organizations do you know that exist that are devoted solely to doing research, solely to developing the model? There aren't many. Most creation organizations are nothing more than apologetics organizations. This is a tragedy. The last organization that had a rigorous research program is the Institute for Creation Research. They chose to redefine themselves as an apologetic organization. Okay? Answers in Genesis has a research journal where they collect research and publish it in a peer-reviewed journal online, free to the public. The International Conference on Creationism is a conference forum devoted to developing the creation model of origins. But none of these organizations are devoted to research. They don't go seeking money for research. They don't have a financial base to do that. And we really need to do that. It's kind of a shame that we're in the situation that we are in today in 2015. That needs to change. Logos Research, as far as I can tell, is really the only organization that has some funding devoted to research. And so that needs to change. The biblical worldview alone gives coherency to the data. So the data that you and I might find in the world, such as the Grand Canyon, is provided coherency through the biblical worldview. So let's take a look now at our presuppositions, data, and evidence. What are the differences between these three, and how do they make sense? Well, the question is, what is data? Well, when we examine the Grand Canyon, for example, we observe these layers, the strata, that apparently was laid down somehow, right? We didn't see it laid down, but we know that they were laid down somehow because they exist in that fashion, right? The important thing to remember, though, is this is data, and it's not evidence. It's not evidence for anything. So when you and I are looking at the Grand Canyon, all we're looking at these layers, right? We didn't see it happen. We don't know how it happened from a pure empirical perspective. So interpreting the data with one's set of presuppositions causes the data to become evidence for one's particular model. So what that means is that when you come to the Grand Canyon, you don't come with it with some blank mind. You come with it with a set of presuppositions as to how those layers got there, how they were laid down. That becomes evidence now for your model. So we're compelled to conclude then that evidence is equal to data plus interpretation. And we'll see this. We'll see how this really makes a distinguishing idea in the next slide. We can also say that evidence is data plus presuppositions or even worldview. So when I look at the Grand Canyon, I bring to the Grand Canyon a certain set of presuppositions, and that is how I interpret the data. That becomes evidence then for my model. Now imagine an evolutionist and creationist. They're sitting on the edge of the Grand Canyon romanticizing how it came to be. They're looking at the same stuff, but they come up with two different conclusions to how it got there, right? Well, what's making it different? They're looking at the same rocks, at the peat sandstone and all that. What's making it different? It's their set of presuppositions, right, that they bring to the argument. So let's take a look now. Let's compare the evolution model with the creation model, and how would they look? How would an evolutionist and a creationist look at the Grand Canyon? All right, these are the general trends for evolution. Strata were laid down over long periods of geologic time. Okay? This might imply that bedding planes should show erosion. So if it took 1,000,000 years to lay down this layer, and another 1,000,000 years to lay down that layer, you would think that in between the layers, as this one was building, that there would be signs of erosion on the bottom layer, right? Rain, floods, what have you. That's what you would expect. You would also expect that the higher strata are the younger strata than the lower, okay? That the lower strata are older than the ones on top. So that means that time changing is vertical throughout the column, okay? You go from older to younger, so there's a vertical line going from the bottom to the top in terms of age. Lower is older, higher is younger. Well, let's compare that with creation. Strata were laid down quickly by catastrophic processes, okay? That would imply that bedding planes should show little erosion, right? If this guy was laid down very soon after this guy below it, then you would expect to find very little erosion at the planes, the bedding planes between the layers. Strata were laid down in laminar flows. As we saw in Mount St. Helens last time, that's strategically why we showed Mount St. Helens. I was at 2 weeks ago. We saw that in an explosion, hundreds and hundreds of layers were laid down in an explosion within minutes, right? So this layer here is the same age as this layer here, and so on, which means that time then, the flow of time, was not vertical, but it was horizontal with respect to the flow, right? So the chronological time arrow then is not vertical like in the old Earth model, but it's horizontal with respect to the flow. Okay? So time changing is almost horizontal. As we said before, Guy Berthaud has a wonderful set of videos on this where he shows these laminar flows. They're flowing in this way, and the layers are literally being laid down simultaneously. So these are the presuppositions that each one of these folks would bring to the table, and that's why they come up with a different view of the Grand Canyon. All right. Since the publishing of the Genesis flood, creationists have almost exclusively tried to show the science of the creation model. This is the fundamental characteristics of the modern creationist period from 1961 to 1986. Now, what we mean by this statement is there was very little effort on the part of the creation movement in this time period, the modern creation period, where creationists would try to discuss and try to expose the religious nature of evolution. Okay? What they were trying to do was trying to build the scientific worthiness or the scientific development of the creation model. Now, that's a worthy task. But during this period, they almost exclusively focused on that effort. Okay? Trying to come up with the scientific explanation from a creationist perspective. Now, there wasn't much systemization going on, but a lot of independent research efforts and things like that, and that characterized the modern creationist movement. However, in recent years, creationists are beginning to address the religious nature of the evolutionary paradigm. In this regard, the religious biases of evolutionary materialism is being laid open. This activity generally attacks the very roots of the evolutionary materialism and not merely the fruit. So only in recent years has creationism begun to focus on the religious nature of evolution. And the religion that is undergirding evolution is materialism. And that is finally being shown by creationists as a whole. And that's something that should have been done from Jump Street. So generally speaking, creationists need to understand that we are in a three-front war. First, we must develop a rigorous biblical model of origins. This is something we need to continue to do. We must develop a rigorous scientific model of origins. This is something that we also need to do, but that requires an organized effort and money to do that, right? Experimentation, setting up laboratories, and so on. We must apologetically reduce the religion of evolutionary materialism to its natural absurdity. So they are three areas that we need to focus on. So in some sense, it's worse than World War II. Hitler fought a two-front war, and he lost, while creationists have to fight a three-front war. However, we shouldn't despair, because the Allies, the United States in particular, and many others, fought a two-theater war during World War II, right? People forget that. It wasn't a two-front war that the United States and the Allies fighting. It was a two-theater war. So if the Allies can win a two-theater war, certainly we can win a three-front war. So we want to show that that evolution is, in fact, at its very root, a religious concept. Show that it fails on its own weight, and show that it is self-contradictory. And we want to attack the root, not merely the fruit. So these are some of the things that we need to do. So by understanding this three-front war, it must be recognized by those who would argue that the biblical apologetic method does away with the scientific method, is fundamentally contrary to the biblical model of apologetics, and that the pursuit of the development of the scientific creation model is a necessary and honorable pursuit. So we honor the Creator by attempting to understand His creation, whether by biblical apologetics or the scientific method. So if you and I would get into the laboratory and come up with models that could become part of the creation model of origins, in so doing, we're honoring the Creator, because we're saying, number one, His creation is worthy enough to study, and that He, as an individual, as a person, as the Creator, is worthy to study. And so this is an honorable thing. So for those people who want to say that presuppositionalism does away with the scientific method, they need to rethink their position. It does anything else but. So, let's take a look then at the creation, the flood, and the biblical model of aging. So this is one of the applications that we want to look at. An application of the creation flood model. How does it impact this idea of aging? Something we're all interested in, right? We're all aging, whether we're young or old. And so let's take a look. Well, if we look at the longevity of the antediluvians, that is the people that lived before the flood, from creation to the flood, there was 1,656 years. The average lifespan of those individuals, you can see, is much greater than what we had today. We have the patriarchs starting from Adam to Noah, and so on. So the average life expectancy of these antediluvians was 908 years. Now this is according to the Hebrew text, which I think in this case is the better text than the Septuagint. And the average generation, now this doesn't mean the average age at which they had children, but the average age in which they had the messianic child, okay, was 117 years. So the average life expectancy was 908 years. The average messianic generation was 117 years. So what might have been some of the causes for the longer antediluvian lifespan? Do we have any idea of how this could happen? Well, I think we do, and we can take a look at this. Why did the antediluvians live so much longer? Now remember, we're taking those ages at face value. You know, the biblical text is knowable by using the same rules of grammar and syntax that it was written with, right? And it was written to an original audience, and they would have understood these years to be exactly that, 908 years. Okay? So I take these years to be normative, that is literal. So it was a normal event for an antediluvian to live 908 years. All right, let's take a look. Pre-fall nutritional model. This is one area, one possibility of why antediluvians lived so long. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat," or food. So prior to the flood, man was a vegetarian. He ate no animal flesh. Man received all his nutritional needs through vegetation. Okay, so the question ultimately is, how did this happen? Why is this? How could this be? How could man receive all his nutritional needs through plant life, right? From a guy's perspective, I like the meat, right? All right. Genesis 2:5, "And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground." So, the idea here is that the antediluvian hydrologic cycle was different. Okay? A mist went up from the ground and watered the whole face of the ground. So let's take a look at how this might have worked out. Well, here we have a picture of the antediluvian stratigraphic record. And you can see that water would have percolated its way up through the sedimentary layers that were created on day 3, if you remember when we covered that. So you want to bring all this information we had from the earlier sessions to this particular picture. And along with it, it was bringing certain things. So plant life was watered from below. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it didn't rain before the flood. I'm simply saying that there is a mechanism besides rain that is watering vegetation. And if it's coming up through these sedimentary layers, it's bringing mineral-rich water to the vegetation, right? We know of today, and I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we know today that our plants are not as nutritious as they could be, right? There's also a reason why God told the Jews not to plant on the 7th year, right? Let the land rest. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, it's going to rain for an entire year, right? Without being planted, without nutrition, minerals being taken out of the soil. And so the ground can rejuvenate itself. But in the antediluvian age, you didn't need that. You didn't need the sabbatic rest year. So this would have been healthier for plant life. It could have aided in gigantism. And man was naturally receiving proper nutrition. So when Adam or Eve pulled a fruit off the tree or picked up a legume or a veggie from the ground, they were naturally getting more nutrition in those plants than we are today. Now, what the proper nutrition is, I don't know. That's something we need to research. A lot of research is going into that, but not from a creation perspective. Okay, so the idea here is that the pre-fall nutrition model includes this hydrologic cycle whereby antediluvian plant life is watered from below, bringing to it mineral-rich, calcium-rich water. Okay. Well, a second thing besides better nutrition, there may have been some kind of canopy before the flood, okay, around the earth. Now, just let me say one thing here. Most creationists have abandoned the so-called canopy model. The reason why they've abandoned the canopy model is because they held to a vapor canopy model. And as you know, water holds a lot of heat. And that has a lot of problems from a chemical perspective, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a second. Genesis 1:6, and God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." So there's a space between the waters below and the waters above. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So on the second day, the universe, prior to this, remember, the entire universe existed as one ball of water, right? Well, on the second day, God separated the waters. Okay, so he kept the waters right in the center, let's say, for sake of argument, and he took the remaining waters and took them to the edge, right? He separated, put a space between these waters in the center and the waters at the outer edge, and that is what he calls the universe. Okay, and we know this from verses 14 and 15, where he tells us what is in the firmament, namely the stars, that are given for signs and seasons, the earth, the moon, and so on. Okay, so this is the first reference to this watery universe. The canopy model, no matter what flavor, has been essentially jettisoned by most creation researchers, and I give the reference to an Answer in Genesis article there, which essentially states that. However, exegetically speaking, the text actually states that the canopy, that is the waters above, surrounds the entire cosmos. The passage we just read said God separated the waters. He kept the waters here, which are below, and the waters above around the so-called universe. And we see this in Ezekiel 1:22 through 28, where God is referring to the Ophanim, the lowest rank of the cherubim. You know, the cherubim is a rank of angels that comprises three sub-ranks, the highest rank being the seraphim, the middle rank being the Zoa, and the third rank being the Ophanim, the wheels in Ezekiel 1, right? So they are the three ranks of angels that make up the angels that surround the throne, that have something to do with the throne. Okay? And the Ophanim, the wheels, if you remember, are described with having this crystal sea above their head, which is the same thing referred to in Revelation, where the throne sits upon the crystal sea. And this is at the edge of the universe, so to speak. However, that plays out is for another talk. However, as God separated the waters, He could have allowed residual waters to remain around the earth, which we can use to empirically model an antediluvian canopy. Okay? And this is where I think creationists have missed the boat exegetically. The Bible, the biblical text, allows us freedom to have to model a pre-flood canopy. Okay? Now, my argument is maybe it's not water. He could have used some other type of canopy flavor, which is what we state here. So perhaps there was another kind of canopy surrounding the earth that does work scientifically. So regardless of the type of canopy, it might have aided in reducing carbon-14 production and its ingesting. We saw that several sessions ago. Having a canopy around the earth would have reduced cosmic radiation, right, getting to the biosphere. It would have also increased the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You know, you and I need carbon dioxide too. And each of these would go into better general health, lack of pollutants, more availability of O2 and CO2 for both man and plant. So if there was a canopy, then we can model some type of flavor to help us aid in this. So let's take a look here. So here we have the earth, and we have some kind of canopy surrounding the earth. And if there is some type of canopy, it would have helped protect us from carbon-14. You know, as we saw, if you remember, carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere. It aligns itself with oxygen, becomes carbon dioxide. Plants ingest carbon dioxide. They eventually die. We eat the meat, and so on. So there's a nice carbon cycle there, and so that helps in aging, right? Well, it also would minimize or reduce cosmic radiation getting to the surface of the earth and causing mutations in animals and plants. And perhaps it would have caused a greater partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, which would have been good for both plant and animal. The water vapor canopy is problematic. The main problem in the canopy, besides stability, is heat production. When you take the model and attempt to ask the question, how much water is required to provide all the things that the canopy has to do, you find that there's too much water. And if you remember your high school chemistry, water holds a lot of heat. And the water would have produced a very hot environment on the earth, so much so that some of the models that some creationists have come up with argue that it would have been too hot for man to survive. So the water canopy, the vapor canopy, has been essentially abandoned by most creationists. So my argument is let's try carbon dioxide. Russ Humphreys suggested this many years ago, but there's never been any serious modeling of a CO2 canopy, as far as I know. And so I think we ought to do that. So if there's any chemists here, maybe you want to try to give that a shot. So, number 3, Earth's magnetic field. There we see the Earth's magnetic field. I think we've seen this slide before. As you know, the Earth's magnetic field helps us. It protects us. The strengths of the Earth's magnetic field would have been much greater prior to the flood, according to this model. It would have provided greater protection against cosmic radiation. This implies less carbon-14 production, less cosmic radiation reaching the ground, and less genetic mutations as a result. So having the Earth's magnetic field greater, stronger in the past, would help us also in these things that the canopy model would also help us as well, except it doesn't help too much with the higher partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, what can we say? The antediluvian environment was advantageous for a longer life expectancy. Less cosmic radiation making it to the biosphere, less radioactive carbon dioxide in the biosphere. Perhaps greater partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide may allow for gigantism and faster healing, and other possible positive effects by a stronger magnetic field. So if we can utilize these sub-elements in our model, a greater propensity for a healthy environment existed in the antediluvian world. Okay, so everybody lived happily in 900 years. And, well, along came the flood. Destroyed the canopy and reduced the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, as we saw in several sessions earlier. This would have increased cosmic radiation, increased carbon-14 production, and it would have modified, more than likely reduced, the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? This would have destroyed the antediluvian hydrologic cycle. Plants are no longer watered from below, but now have to depend upon rain and only rain for its water. So plants depend on rain for water. And as a result, plants are not as nutriated as before the flood. Okay? So man is exposed to what I call a lesser earth. Well, here we see the magnetic field of the earth. Notice that prior to the flood, it was stronger. The flood then came along and reduced the magnetic field to essentially what it is today. And so we don't have the strength of the field to protect us from cosmic radiation. So the implications of the flood: man is susceptible now to more hostile elements. He is also hostile to, or susceptible to hostile animals, hostile plants. You and I get poison oak, poison ivy, so on. However, if you ever get poison ivy, you'll notice that very often a plant called watercress is always nearby. Take a piece of watercress, open it up, and spread it on the poison ivy. I found it to be very successful drying it up. The geographical landscape radically changed. Pangea split, and now we have the continental view that we have today. And as a result, man's longevity decreased radically. So because the environment so radically changed, the protections that were built in to the antediluvian earth were taken away, man's life expectancy began to decrease. Here we have a graphical view of the patriarchs after the flood, beginning with Shem and going to Serug. And if you notice, there's a wonderful piece of information here that this graph shows. Notice that between Eber and Peleg, the life expectancy is cut in half. Eber lived over 400 years. Peleg lived just over 200 years. The life expectancy right after the flood was cut in half. And that was within maybe 200, 250 years after the flood. Man only lived 200 years. Now that sounds a lot to us today, right? Who live on average 70. Pangea split during the generation of Peleg. Eber, Peleg's father, is the last long-living post-flood patriarch. He was the last patriarch to have a 400-year lifespan. Lifetime is essentially cut in half, 450 to about 200. No canopy or magnetic field for protection. Less nutriated vegetation for man and animal. Reduced partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide for bioavailability. So our summary conclusions. Today's nutritional standards are woefully less than truly required. Okay? We need to research the nutritional needs of man within the confines of a biblical worldview. This is if I was a millionaire, this is one of the areas that I would certainly provide a lot of research money for. Create laboratories and things like that. Use the biblical model. This is what we should be doing. Using the biblical model to come up with a complete view of aging and how to reverse it. Yeah. The American nutritional pyramid, inaccurate if not outright wrong. This has been known for quite some time. Creationists have allowed evolutionary models to create the current model of nutrition. Even the so-called alternative models are evolutionarily based. And I want to recommend a book. It's written in the early 80s, but it's a wonderful book called Life Extension by Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw. They have a lot of good information. I don't agree with everything, but they have a lot of good information in a book that's about this thick. And he's a physicist and she's a biochemist, I believe. And it's all based on evolution, and it's a tragedy. You know, some people want to argue, that, rightly so, that we should be having a different ratio of protein and carbohydrates, right? The argument from an evolutionary perspective is, well, the cavemen, all they did was eat meat, okay? And that's the argument for you eating more protein, right? Well, that's not quite what the biblical model is. That's not why the biblical model might argue that our ratio to protein and carbohydrates should be different, okay? So we've missed the boat. We need to use the creation model to come up with a proper nutritional model. All right. Our second and final application of the creation flood model is environmental management, environmentalism. As an Eagle Scout, this is kind of close to my heart because the environmentalist movement, as I see it happening in the secular world, is a travesty in my view. Even from just a scouting perspective, I was brought up on the idea of conservation. I was never brought up in the idea that you and I should be worshiping nature, okay? And bringing the biblical creation model to this particular issue is an important thing. And we're going to be showing a video during this, and I'll be interested to hear during the question and answer period your reaction to the video. All right. God created planet Earth as a self-sufficient system, which includes the star Sol. I don't know if did everybody know that the name of our sun is Sol? Okay. Some people don't know that, and I thought I'd just say that. Man was created on the sixth day, and he's in charge for caring for the earth. The entire globe is under the management of man. Okay, that's his responsibility. He is to have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth, according to Genesis 1:28. So our responsibility is to care for the planet. And what's going to be interesting is we'll see how we have violated this mandate time and time again, not just today, but in other places. Part of man's responsibilities is to manage, that is, have dominion, the earth and all the creatures contained therein. The horses, the coyotes, the alligators, they're our responsibility, okay? Not just the dogs. Because of this, man was spread out over the earth and express his dominion. So that's the reason why God said, move out, okay? Go throughout the earth. Express your dominion around the globe. Manage, take care of the earth, okay? Fill the earth and subdue it. Okay? Conquer it, manage it. God never intended planet Earth to be left to the probabilities of the wind. When you read a lot of the secular evolutionary literature, this is what you get. You get this evolutionary concept of randomness brought to the management of the environment. And that's a shame, because the world was never meant to be left up to probability and chance. Replenish the earth, and the fear of you, now this is after the flood, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moves upon the earth, and upon the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. Even as the green herb, I have given you all things. So a lot of things here. Man is to replenish the earth, to fill the earth again after the flood. Okay, he's to multiply and so on. God is putting the fear of man into the animals. Okay, now why is he doing that? He's doing that to make it natural for the animals to hightail it away from man so that they would spread over the earth. Okay? Isn't that interesting? Okay, so the animals that were on the ark left and took off. And one of the interesting things is, have you ever wondered why there are some really interesting and unusual marsupials in Australia and often nowhere else? Well, it's because if you take a marsupial, right, they have a child, right? Well, marsupial, like a kangaroo, can put the child in his pouch and keep moving. But if you're a bear, you have to stop for a little bit for a couple of years, raise your young. And so as a result, the marsupials were able to make it further in the same amount of time. And so by the time the continents in the days of Peleg were split, the animals were able to make it throughout those continents and eventually be trapped. And so that's why we find those kind of creatures there and not necessarily in the Middle East any longer. But okay, so every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. So man is now permitted to eat meat. Now I would argue that the reason for that is because some of the nutritional needs are no longer available because of the destruction of the earth by the flood. Okay, and so after the flood, man had the same responsibility to disperse through the planet and fill the earth. In this way, man could fulfill his responsibility of managing the planet. In order for animals to repopulate the earth, God put the fear of man in them so that they would naturally disperse throughout the globe and fill the earth. So now you understand why the whole issue of Babel is important. By man staying in one place, they were not fulfilling their eternal hope of subduing the earth. Okay? See, part of the Gentile hope, right? Part of the Gentile hope is to fill the earth, to be the engineers, the technicians, the biologists, and so on, that manage the earth, plant the fields, the farmers, and so on. That was the hope given to the average Gentile man, right? And they failed to do that. They stayed in the Babylon area. Animal flesh is now allowed to be normally eaten by mankind. Okay. Now, this brings us to the managing of the environment. Man is to spread out over the earth, to subdue it, and to manage it. So, how is he to do that? What is the impact of man's sin in his ability to take dominion over the earth? Man's responsibility is to manage the earth and its environment. That is what is meant by taking dominion. Well, what it doesn't mean is as follows. Abusing the environment. Man is not to rape and pillage the countryside. Managing is always to be in view. Abusing the environment is a sin. I'll never forget, way back in the late 60s, I was canoeing down the Allegheny River up north here. And somewhere up around Kennerdale, I believe, there was a pipe, maybe about a foot in diameter, and what was coming out of that pipe was incredible. And it wasn't just a drop. It was flying out of this pipe, and it looked exactly like tomato soup. And I'll never forget seeing that, because I'm thinking, what is that doing to the river and the creatures in the river? I actually remember thinking that when I saw that as we're canoeing past that pipe. I don't know what kind of a plant it was. I don't know what it was, but it was just coming out and gushing into the river. Not using the environment is a sin. Giving the environment to the probabilities of the wind is not managing the environment. And I am purposely stating that way. I'm not saying not using, I'm saying non-using. That is, I want to say it in a more radical way. Okay, the non-using of the environment is a sin. In other words, if we let the environment up to the probabilities of the wind, to our notions of randomness and chance, that's also a sin. And all this manifests itself in various ways, as we will see. So these are two opposite, but they were equal environmental sins. It's just as bad to abuse the environment as it is not to use it. You know what happens when you don't use your house, right? Have you ever been in a house that's been just sitting there? The second law of thermodynamics takes over, right? It becomes dusty and eventually things start falling down. It's the same way with the environment. All right, let's look at an example of raping and pillaging the environment. The deforestation of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I don't know if you know this, but almost the entire state of Pennsylvania was deforested at one time. Have you ever wondered why you don't run into, even around here, you don't run into any huge oak trees that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, right? Trees are relatively youthful around here. If you go down to, what's the name of on top, just outside of Uniontown, there's a camp, Christian retreat, Jamonville. Thank you, Steve. If you go to Jamonville, go to their library. They have pictures of this area from that mountain, from the summit of where Jamonville is, from 1870. You will not see a tree in sight. It's amazing, and that's 1870. And so this whole area was at one time deforested. Well, this is an example of abuse. It's not wrong to cut trees down. It's not wrong to deforest certain areas, but do it in a reasonable, manageable, environmentally friendly way. And I'm not talking, when I say environmentally friendly, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about environmentalism. I'm talking about let's do this in a biblical way. Much of Pennsylvania was deforested by the later 19th century. Parts of Cook's Forest, however, remain as virgin forests. We'll come back to that. That river right there is the mighty Susquehanna, filled with logs being taken to various places to be cut down, to be sawed and used for housing and so on. Now, it's not wrong to use this, but if you're going to do it in a silly, destructive way, then it is wrong. It is a sin to abuse. Okay? It's kind of similar to eating, right? It's not wrong to eat, but it's wrong to be a glutton, right? All right. Let's look at an example of letting the forests go to the wind. The notion of old-growth forests. This is an example of what I call non-use. And here we see an example. This is an actual picture from Cook's Forest. I've got some others here too. And I'm sorry they didn't come out very well. I wish they would have come out well. Several years ago, my wife and I went up to Cook's Forest, and I took some pictures. And I explicitly had this particular presentation in mind. And you can't tell from this particular picture, but the floor is absolutely dead. There's nothing on this forest floor. And when we were standing there, it was dead silence. It was the eeriest feeling. All the life in the forest is up in the canopy. Okay? One of the problems that you and I face every day in this area are deer, right? There are deer all over the place. In fact, I should have counted the number of deer we saw roadkill on the way down, but there was at least 3 that I can remember just today coming here. Well, there aren't any deer up there. There are very few deer up in this area. It's because there's nothing for them to eat. The forest is dead. All the life is in the canopy. So there's a problem with this mindset that we should let everything go to the winds, the probability of the winds, and let things become old growth. That's not what our mission is as men and women who are given the mandate to manage the environment by God Himself. It's not wrong to let some places go old growth because it might be fun to see how big an oak tree can get, right? But in terms of general policy, you want to keep the most efficient forests going because that helps the deer, that helps all the animal life have food and things like that. So if we have this mindset that we have to let our forests all become old growth forests, we're killing a lot of animals. Let alone our cars, right? Most of the life is in the forest canopy. The large trees, especially the hemlock and white pine, are so dense at the top that insufficient light gets to the forest floor, and the ground vegetation and fauna die due to the lack of sunlight. And what was interesting too is I remember the earth, the dirt in that area was extremely dark, very rich soil. It's kind of a shame, but nothing could grow. Forest animals starve and move away due to lack of browse. A lot of organizations, the 4-H clubs, the scouting groups, they often go up to the northern forests up here, cut trees down and let them lie there. And they do that so that the deer can get browse so they can eat during the winter months. In these old growth forests, however, the forest floor is absolutely dead. Old growth forests are extremely inefficient. So the idea of letting all forests without exception become old growth forests is not good. Leaving our forests to the probabilities of the wind is not managing our forests very well. This is an example of the non-using of the environment. So this is a great sin, equal but opposite to abusing. Okay? And in some sense it is, right? If we're not using the planet, we're abusing the planet. So the very act of not using it or seeking dominion is abusing the planet. Often the environmental issue is presented in such a way that the only way to approach the problem is through an evolutionary mindset or pagan way. Often the vocabulary and attitudes expressed by environmentalists are rooted in paganism and the worship of creation. Indeed, environmentalism has the propensity of leading to statism. This is because environmentalism, many of the issues in environment, I don't mean to get political here, but I will make the comment. Because this issue can be and is often ill-defined and ill-presented intentionally, it's something that is used to bring people under control. Okay? And this is a real problem. So we have to be careful. This is another reason why we as creationists should be going into environmental science and showing that there is a rational way based upon the biblical text that we can manage our environment, and it doesn't have to be ill-defined. Once again, creationists have missed an opportunity to show how the biblical worldview provides a rational solution. The reason why I picked these two particular examples tonight, namely, mostly the issue of nutrition, but generally the issue of aging, and then this issue of environmental management or environmentalism, is because years ago I was talking to Dwayne Gish. I don't know if you know Dwayne Gish. Dwayne Gish was one of the leaders of the creation movement a generation ago. And he told me that when the creationists that started what we would call the modern creationist movement after the publishing of the Genesis flood in 1961, they were aware, and what they wanted to do was they wanted to avoid certain topics that they felt were kind of kooky. And one of them was nutrition, and the other was environmentalism, environmental management. Because apparently, according to him, a lot of kooks, so to speak, were in those areas, and they wanted to avoid those areas. And I think that's a tragedy. We missed an opportunity. All right. Let's take a final look at something here. In Paul's inspired commentary in Romans chapter 1, he says, regarding the Gentile world, you have to remember what the context here is. Paul is assessing through the inspired text and inscripturating his opinion, his commentary, if you will, in Romans chapter 1 concerning the Gentile world. Because the Gentiles rejected Jehovah. Okay? And so he's talking about the Gentile world from the flood to the call of Abraham. And he says of these Gentiles who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creation more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. That is a remarkable commentary on the history of mankind in general. So the Gentiles, every pagan religion you see, whether it be Hinduism or the more animistic religions, are all a result of mankind abandoning God. See, evolution tells us that man started out animistic, then he became polytheistic, and then he eventually evolved up into this great Trinitarian monotheism. Okay, that is the evolutionist's view of how we arrived at Christianity. That's not what the biblical text says. The Bible says the exact opposite. Man began to worship God as the Trinitarian, with God as a Trinity and a singular God, right? Well, I mean, isn't that what the Trinity is? 3 persons in one unified essence. Okay, so man began worshiping God as the great Trinity, and eventually de-evolved, if you will, into paganism and eventually animism and so on. So the biblical view of the history of man is exactly opposite of what we learn in the evolutionary circles and in our secular world. And Romans 1 is an example of this. So, keeping Romans 1:25 in the back of our mind, that Paul stated this 2,000 years ago about the Gentile world 2,000 years before that, right? Let's take a look at what we see, because I think we're going to be rather surprised, and I'll be anxious to hear what your reactions are to this video during the question and answer period.
Deep in the woods of North Carolina, an extremist eco group called Earth First bewails the violation of American nature.
I want to mourn the loss of all the old growth trees I've seen, and tell them that we love them and that we don't want them to die, that there are some people here who do care. So I want you to know that, trees, that we care.
I think we are deeply hurting in America. I think we are deeply craving answers. I think that we've lost our identity as we have evolved into technology and into industrialized society. Bring me to this cathedral. Bring me to those guys. Bring me to this rock that has the most incredible life. That makes me feel alive.
I've looked at clear cuts and burnt forest, and I've felt outraged, but I didn't scream and I didn't cry, and I need to.
In the 13th century. So what we've looked at here is the idea of apologetics, how we are to defend the faith, the creation faith, if you will, and we've looked at two particular applications of the creation model of origins. We've looked at the model of aging and the model of environmental management. So I hope everybody has appreciated this series, and I hope we've actually come away with having a little bit better understanding of what the creation model is. I know we've covered a lot. Some of the lectures are very difficult to go through in the first session or in one session, but I hope that we can come away with having a little bit better understanding of the issue at hand. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. And we can open it up for questions and so on.